Right, so thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks for your patience as we try to get things straightened out. My name is David Robinson. I am the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, the LSA, which is sponsoring this webinar. My pronouns are he, him, his. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us, and I hope you and yours are staying safe and healthy. While I'm talking, you'll be seeing a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. You will also see some information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar. So we're excited to present this webinar on peer review in honor of Peer Review Week, which concludes today. Our panelists are Andres Kutsia, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Michigan and editor of the LSA's flagship journal, Language. We have had, I'm not sure if she was back yet, we were having some technical issues with her internet connection. Fernanda Ferreira, Professor of Psychology at the University of California, Davis, and past editor of the Journal of Experimental Psychology General. And finally, Chris Kennedy, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Chicago and former Associate Editor of Language. I've also had the pleasure of working with both Chris and Andres when they served in different years as chairs of the LSA's program committee. I'd like to take just a few moments to let you know how the webinar will work and to make sure you're familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel. We have an outline of the talk, which will play as the panelists speak. We have a copy of it, which you will find in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar dashboard, and you can download it there. We'll also have it available on our website after the webinar, and I'll send you a link then. Also, you may have noticed that your microphones are muted. This is so we don't get a lot of miscellaneous background noise from the attendees. We do encourage you to ask questions, however, and you can ask those using the questions widget on your dashboard. If your questions are for a particular panelist, please let us know, and the last part of the webinar will be devoted to question and answer. So I would like to go ahead and turn the floor over to our first speaker, who is Andres Kutsia, and I will get that slideshow running momentarily.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. I see that Fernanda is again visible in the list of participants without video. Unfortunately, it seems that Fernanda's video is not going to cooperate, but I hope this means that she was able to join us. So thank you, David, for the introductions, and thank you to Chris and Fernanda for sharing with me the presentation, and thank you to all of you for logging on and spending approximately 90 minutes with us today. As David said, I'm Andres Kutsia. I'm currently editor of Language, was previously chair of the LSA's program committee. So in addition to just having been academic for more than 2 decades, I guess these assignments have given me opportunity to read more peer reviews and write more peer reviews than the average linguist. But one thing I hope you'll take away from this discussion this afternoon is that writing a peer review doesn't really require a lot of additional skills to what you anyway have as just being academic, right? So in your daily research work, you read other people's research, you identify what's the contribution that the research makes, you identify what's the gaps or the shortcomings in the research, what follow-up studies might have to be, and that's basically what doing a peer review is what you anyway do when you do your ordinary research writing. So Chris and Fernanda and I are here today as experts, but in a real sense, we're not really experts because peer review is actually quite broadly distributed amongst the research community, and all of us engage in it. And one more general comment before we delve into the details. This is something that my colleague and friend Robin Queen here at University of Michigan told me very early at my time at Michigan 16 years ago. And that is that we should think of the whole academic writing experience as a very slow conversation, and each action is a conversational turn. So when you submit a manuscript to a journal, you are making the first conversational turn. And then the review that you receive back is a response to your opening statement. It might take months before you get that response, but it's still part of the conversation. And then you continue the conversation in your revision and your response letter to the reviews. Progress in science and in research is fundamentally collaborative, right? It's dependent on the research community. And reviewing is just part of that collaborative effort, right? It's part of the conversation. So I think if we think about peer review like this, as reviewers, it will make us write better reviews because we will think of what we do as part of a conversation and not speaking the final word. As receivers of reviews of our work, I think it makes it easier to digest those reviews if you think about it as just another turn in the conversation, and now you have the obligation to listen to that respectfully, but also the opportunity to respond to that and to keep the conversation going. So it has helped me to think about the whole research writing process and review process like this, and it's how I still try to approach it today also in my work. David, can you move to the next slide? And actually to even the next one. So here is our plan for today. Chris, Fernanda, and I will start out by each talking briefly about an aspect of the peer review process, alternating between the three of us a little bit. We're hoping to get through all of this in roughly 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And that will then allow ample time at the end for Q&A and general discussion. So if you have any questions, keep track of them so that you can ask them when we get to that part of the process. Since peer review is present across the whole landscape of research in which we engage, it's actually a part of many parts of our life as researchers, and therefore we want to touch on several of them. Right, so we get peer reviews in journals, conferences, and grant submissions. So we want to briefly touch on each of those. Both you as the author and the reviewer is involved in the review process. So we want to look at it from both sides of the two parties. And both parties involved in the process have certain responsibilities. So as an author, what do you have to do? As a reviewer, how do you have to do so? And also some rights. And we want to touch on all of those. David, next slide. Okay, so I will start out by talking about peer review for journals. I will talk about it from the perspective of the author, and then I'll hand over to Chris, who will talk about it from the perspective of the reviewer, and then we'll hand over to Fernanda and cycle through us all a little bit. So let's delve into journals, first thinking together about your responsibilities and rights as an author in the process. Given the central role that peer review and peer-reviewed journal publications play in the linguistics job market and in things like promotion and tenure reviews, this is an aspect of the peer review process with which all of us will engage many, many times over our careers, both as an author and a reviewer. And here are some things that I think is helpful to keep in mind as an author in your participation in this process, in this conversation. First of all, you should make it as easy as possible on the reviewer, right? So remember that your submission to a journal is the first conversational turn. Make it as easy as possible for your conversational partner, the reviewer, to engage with you in that conversation, to understand what you're saying. So use the academic writing equivalent of discourse markers, right? Structure your paper, give evidence where transitions in the argument is happening. Help the reader, which in this case is the reviewer, to understand what you're doing. And make sure that the shared knowledge that you are assuming is actually shared knowledge, right? In a real conversation, the person you're talking with shares the communicative context with you and have that background. Well, in this case, make sure that your reader has that background. You have been living with this topic for months or years. for the reviewer, in all likelihood, it's the first time that they are really thinking deeply about it. So make sure that you give the information that's necessary to understand, make sure that you make the structure of your argument easy to follow. Reviewing is a lot of work, it takes a lot of effort, and chances are that you'll get a better review if you make the experience for the reviewer an easy and even enjoyable one by presenting a well-presented paper. So the thing you submit for review is not the first draft, it's not even the second draft, it's something that you have revised several times already, maybe even got feedback on it from colleagues or friends. Also, responsibility as an author is make sure you follow the journal's instructions, right? If you're submitting to a journal, go and look at their instructions for authors, make sure you follow it, make sure you format the paper according to how the journal asked for it to be formatted. If the journal has a double-blind review process, read what they say about it, make sure you follow the instructions that they give about that. The first stage of the peer review process at the journal is really that, the editor receiving the paper and doing a very quick check to see whether the paper follows the instructions, the policies of the journal, and you want to pass that stage of the review process so that you can go on to the, the content review part of your paper. It is not required, but often good practice to suggest some reviewers that the editor might call upon to do the review. Why is it good practice? Well, as an editor of a journal, at any given time, you might be handling 50 to 100 papers, and it can be quite time consuming to identify good reviewers. You are an expert on the topic that you're writing on, so you know who the people are who work in that domain. So it could be helpful to the editor to suggest some reviewers. You should do this carefully, though. You don't want to only select reviewers who will evaluate your work positively. That might not be perceived well by the editorial team. And in fact, you also want reviewers who will be critical and help you to see the gaps in your reasoning. One other thing to keep in mind there is not to suggest such a long list of reviewers that you have exhausted all the possible reviewers. Editors will often try to select at least one reviewer who was not on your list. So make sure that you leave out some of the really obvious people who would be willing to engage with your work. It's also possible to unsuggest some reviewers. This is something that should be done with great care and only if it is really, really necessary. So what would be examples of where that is acceptable? If there's somebody who's an obvious reviewer, but with whom you have a conflict of interest, right? So somebody who's a close collaborator of you on another project, or, say your advisor from grad school or a student you're advising, it might be good to just alert the editor, don't ask these people, they have a conflict of interest, and they will therefore most likely decline doing a review. So you just save the editor a step. Also, if you have good reason to believe that a reviewer would not be capable of doing an objective, fair review, you can also mention that and suggest that the editor not ask that person. That should really be done only in extreme, exceptional circumstances, right? You won't expect all reviewers to agree with your work, but only if there's very clear evidence of hard bias against your work or your framework in which you're working. And the last point before I'll hand over to Chris for a while is, can you ask for an update, right? You submit your paper to a journal and it kind of disappears into a black box. It can disappear into that black box for a very long time, and you're anxious to get feedback on the progress of your paper. It is okay to reach out to the editorial team to ask for updates. I would say, probably best to wait 3, 4, 5 months. The review process takes time, so allow enough time for the process to happen. And when you do reach out, do so respectfully. acknowledge the fact that the editorial team is putting in a lot of work and time on your paper and many other papers, and that reviewers are also putting in a lot of time. So, ask respectfully, but you have a right to ask. You have a right to know where your paper is in the process. And last comment, also be careful about what you post on social media about the review process that you are experiencing. Chances are that the editor is also going to be on social media and might see what you're saying. Now, that does not mean that you cannot talk about it on social media or even complain about it on social media. That is what we use places like Twitter and Facebook for, is to have those kinds of conversations. So certainly you can talk about it there, but just remember that that might very well be seen by the editorial team. And although as editors, we try our best to be objective and not impacted by things not relevant to the content of the research, we're people, and it might impact how an editor feels towards your work if you are in an unprofessional way or critical of them in a public sphere such as social media. But again, it doesn't mean you can't complain about editors on social media. You can. That's where we have to do it. Just know that it's a public venue. Okay, Chris, I'll hand over to you to talk about it from the side of the reviewer.
All right, thanks, Andres. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's healthy and doing well, keeping themselves occupied, productive these days. There was one point actually at the end of that last slide that we can come back to at the end. In fact, originally we had left it as a topic to kind of discuss later on. So I just want to highlight that in case people are interested in coming back to that. It's the question of when you as a author might want to appeal a decision. And that's kind of a bigger thing, and we all have something to say about that. So let's keep that in mind and come back to it.
It was on my list, but we can talk about it later.
All right, yeah, we should definitely that could be a big picture question at the end. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about how journal reviewers or reviewers of journal submissions should be thinking about their jobs. And my comments here are informed from being one, but also from being an associate editor for language for a term and an associate editor for Journal of Semantics, which I'm still doing. So the first point, maybe in a way the most important one, and one that pretty much every reviewer knows about, but sometimes might forget in the detail, is the importance of really justifying, in particular, your critical comments or the points that you bring to, if you're a reviewer and you find some issue with a submission that you think warrants a revision or a rejection in particular, and you point that out, it's really crucial to explain exactly why it has the force that it has in some detail. So this could be something as simple as saying that an author needs to engage with Jones 2012. That's the kind of thing you hear a lot. Usually a review will then say, and here's the reason why Jones 2012 is so important for this author to engage with, because Jones 2012 addresses a similar issue, or Jones 2012 brings up some things that call into questions the author's reasoning or something like that. But sometimes that crucial part is left out. And if you're an author who gets something like that in your review, you're obviously a little disgruntled. I mean, you should go out and look for stuff, but as the reviewer, it is part of your job to explain why these criticisms are important. Those are kind of minor cases. Maybe more, even more significant would be cases where you're pointing to a flaw in an experimental design or a flaw in reasoning or something like that. For example, the authors of this paper haven't taken into account the role of context in interpreting their experimental results. Okay, full stop. That should not be a full stop. It should then go on and say, because context could affect the results in ways A, B, C, and D. Okay, I think it really is part of the job to lay out that full line of reasoning. And I will add to that, actually, I mean, you know, the other part of the reviewer's perspective, we might say, is one step up. It's the editor or associate editor, whoever's kind of the person collecting the reviews and kind of interpreting them and sending them to the author. You know, in the cases where a reviewer hasn't quite filled in these gaps, then it's the associate editor's job to either go back to the reviewer and say, hey, add a little bit more here, or fill it in on their own in their reports. I think that's another crucial feature. Timeliness, this is probably pretty obvious. You know, Andres just mentioned, it does take a long time for some of these things to go through, and that affects what you as an author should, you know, when you should say, ask for a status update or something like that. But on the reviewing side, you know, you're part of the equation. And you know, some journals have asked reviewers very explicitly to have the reviews done in a certain amount of time. And if you agree to do it, then you ought to stick to that. You know, life is, as we know right now, life is pretty complicated. We're all busy and things get tough. But I think it's probably true that most reviews, the actual review doesn't actually take more than a few days, let's say. You know, maybe a week. So I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, have the tendency to let these things go for a while, but you know, other people's work is hanging on that. And this is another place actually where the editorial staff, I think, can play a big role. And that's part of our jobs when we're in those positions, to kind of sometimes, you know, be the one asking those reviewers to get their reviews in. When a disagreement should go public. Okay, this is a really interesting thing. So I've sort of observed over the last few years at various points that often in the case of where an article is where reviewers ask for revisions, which is probably the most common case. Occasionally there's this tendency to kind of have the debate about the issue in the review process. And part of the review process is certainly doing that. It's having a debate so that if the paper is ultimately published, it's as good as it can possibly be. It's has maximum impact that it can have, or that it shouldn't be published. You kind of resolve the issue in a different way. But it's really important to think about, you know, to keep in mind that there is a point in there when the role of the reviewer, so to speak, or the person assessing the paper, is to carry on that debate outside in the public, to write a response, to take it out of the private sphere of the reviewing process and put it in the public. And it's good for us as we're reviewing things to kind of ask ourselves often, okay, is this the kind of thing that now we should be talking about outside of this private domain, no matter how committed you are to, say, another opinion than the one that the author's putting forward. Confidentiality, this is probably pretty obvious, but still there's some issues that are worth thinking about. I mean, the review process in general is confidential. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on. We'll talk about single and double blind reviews. But if you're a reviewer, you know, sometimes you need to get some other input on what you're looking at from a colleague, from an advisor or something like that, because you're not sure of your judgment. And that's certainly okay, but you know, that should be done with care, because it, you know, if you're committed to an anonymous review process, you have an obligation to ensure that the identity of the authors remains anonymous. So, you know, if you feel that you need some input, get it, but take that with care. And then kind of related in a way to the last question, of course it's okay to bring ideas from work that you review into your own work at some point. I think this actually happens quite a bit, but it needs to happen after the process has completed, after the work has been published, or after there's some kind of resolution to the work. Maybe it doesn't get accepted, but as long as there's a way to give credit where the credit is due, so that the authors have presented the ideas in some other place, or they posted it publicly, then you can go forward with that. But it cannot be something that happens during the process, the reviewing process. And then the last point for now, as you're a reviewer, you know, sometimes you can and should say no to a reviewing request, no matter In obvious cases or when you have a conflict of interest, you're working, you've advised or you've collaborated or you've been advised by the author or your colleagues. You have too much work to do. It's perfectly legitimate and justifiable to say no if you are overwhelmed, if you think it's too far from your area of expertise. And kind of going back to the timeliness issue, again, this is an important thing. Sometimes we get articles for review and we're saying, oh yeah, this is something I'm really interested in. I know I'm the right person for this because I thought about this for so long. Oh, I've got all this other stuff on my desk, but sure, I could fit this one in. And then, 3 months have gone by or 4 months and you haven't gotten around to touching it. So that's another place where one should say no, no matter how interested you are in the work. Okay, that's all I want to say for the moment. I'll pass it on to Fernanda, hopefully.
Hi, sorry for all the technical problems. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to, in a way, shift gears, but I do want to start by saying that a lot of what you've already heard about peer review applies to grants. So a grant proposal is a document where you're laying out your research, you're trying to make a case. It's a little different from an article, of course, because rather than presenting research that's being done where you're able to draw some conclusions and contribute to the conversation, as we discussed before, you are kind of indicating what kind of a conversation you want to have and how you feel you might be able to contribute to that conversation. So it's more sort of making justified promises rather than providing a finished piece of work that you're then trying to communicate to the field and then hope to get feedback on at later stages in other publications and so on. So a lot of the same rules and guidelines apply. What I thought I would do is just highlight some of the things that are a little bit different about peer review of research grants. So I thought I would first point out something I think all of you know, which is that there are different funding agencies we submit our work to for funding. The National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities might be most common in linguistics, but some people will also do work that would be appropriate for the National Institutes of Health. And each of those agencies has a slightly different process for reviewing grants. Overall, at any federal agency, and also there are non-governmental agencies that fund research, and the process is kind of the same no matter in all of these organizations. There will typically be a set of panelists, and the panelists have been convened to evaluate a number of grants from a specific round. A round would be grants that come in for a particular deadline. So there might be 50 grants to evaluate or 100 grants, but they'll be divided over a number of panelists. Then some agencies also get ad hoc reviewers, which means that in addition to these panelists who have been who are committed to evaluating the grants, there will be people who are asked to evaluate a grant, and their input will go into the mix along with the panelists' impressions. And then there are the staff of the funding agency, and in organizations like the NSF, they play a fairly significant role in deciding whether your research will get funded. Actually, in all the agencies, but in something like NIH, the role of the, say, program officer is very, very codified and very strict. And in something like NSF, it's perhaps a little bit less. The program officer can have a role in evaluating the science. But again, for all of these funding agencies, and for any reviewer, whether it's a panelist or whether it's an ad hoc reviewer or the program officer, they're going to be evaluating your work on a number of criteria. And I'm going to start with clarity because that's already been emphasized for journal articles and for conference submissions. You, especially though in a grant proposal, you want to be super clear, avoiding jargon, avoiding acronyms that could get your reviewers irritated. You want to make the job of the reviewer as straightforward as possible, because they are, especially the panelists, will be reviewing a lot of proposals. So it's really, really helpful to them if you can make the job easy. In addition to that, of course, they're going to be evaluating the significance of the work, the importance of the work. Where does it fit in the sort of scientific landscape? Is this an exciting and important question? Is it research that's likely to advance our theoretical understanding of some phenomenon? And then in addition to that, more and more, we're looking at issues like the robustness of the research and the likelihood of success. And by likelihood of success, I don't mean that you want to propose things that you've already done, but that you want to make sure you make the case that your research is sound enough that you'll be able to draw some conclusions if you follow the research plan as you've laid it out. So for example, you want to make sure you are very specific about details like of the amount of data you intend to collect, the tools that you'll use. If you're not doing in a field where you actually would necessarily be collecting data, you want to make clear what your plan is, what the milestones are going to be, and how you're going to assess whether your hypotheses or ideas are being confirmed or disconfirmed as you go along. And then, of course, it's very important to take into account the track record of the principal investigator, the person who's the person who's submitting the grant. For a junior investigator, this will be less important. For more senior investigators, the track record becomes more and more influential in determining your score or your evaluation. And then there's some consideration of your overall environment. Do you have the sort of facilities and perhaps even colleagues and so on that you would need, the resources you'd need to execute your project? So all of those go into judging the quality of the grant. In most funding agencies, your grant will be assigned some sort of a score, and then there will be a cutoff for funding, which is based on typically budget considerations, which of course can vary from year to year and from administration to administration. The outcome of the review process is that you will normally be assigned to one of three categories. Your grant will be rejected. That's very common. That's all of us have a huge file folder full of our rejected grants. If you're lucky, you will get a revised resubmit, which means that you're being invited to address the concerns that the reviewers raised and try again. Or you will get the happy news that your grant is, one of the top in the pile that was reviewed, and you'll get a funding decision. So that's kind of an overview. I won't talk too much about the way it looks from the perspective of a grant reviewer, except the same principles apply as you've heard already. You want to be very collegial, constructive. You want to respect the anonymity of the person who's submitting the grant. You want to offer helpful feedback, justify your concerns about the work, make sure that you are specific, and yeah, and I think that will do for now. So I'll pass it on to the next stage.
Actually, before we move on, can I just ask a question to Fernanda? And
yes.
see if she agrees with this, and we'll go to conferences. So one of the things that, just as a kind of strategy or heuristic for dealing with the case where you haven't been rejected and you haven't been funded, you've got to revision. So what I took away from time serving on the NSF panel, and actually from actual personal experience submitting grant proposals, is that the first order of business there is pay really, really close attention to what the review panel says about your proposal, to their interpretation of the reviews, and to their recommendations for what you did. And like that should really kind of be the guiding force for how you kind of conceptualize your revisions. Do you think that's more or less right?
I do. I think that's absolutely right. When you get your feedback, what you want to look at really closely are the things that are in the panel summary. It's also very useful to talk to the staff at the agency and see what kind of guidelines they can give you about what to pay attention to and what might be a little bit less important. This is actually an aspect of peer review that's maybe general, and we can talk more about it later. But one of the things that's really critical to appreciate is that reviewers often get things wrong, and editors will know it, and the program officer at the funding agency will perhaps know that a reviewer has misunderstood some point or is proposing, in my own field, a data analysis approach that we know is out of date and inappropriate. But that can't be said publicly. It's not like that reviewer's mistake can be called out. And this is very frustrating to people trying to address comments, whether it's a paper you submitted to a journal or a grant you've submitted, because you have to be able to kind of almost read between the lines and see, okay, in the case of the grants, in the panel summary, they're not picking up on this point that the reviewer made, so perhaps I don't need to address it. And again, that's when it can be really helpful to talk to program staff and sort of go through the points that were raised and discuss, is this something I should tend to? Is this something that is less of an issue that I need to worry about? So does that answer your question, Chris? Is that about what you were thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm totally right. I don't know if Andres wants to add anything about that applying just as well to the journal publication process.
So the one point I left off my discussion, which Chris pointed out, is kind of what we've been talking about now, and that is, what if a reviewer gets it wrong, right? How do you appeal a negative review or a negative decision? And I think the points that Fernanda mentioned just now applies not just to grants, to journals also. Reviewers there also get it wrong, and editors might also get it wrong. So there are times when you might want to, write back to the editor or write to the program officer and say, I feel my work was, but respectfully, my work was misunderstood. Can we discuss this? Can we think about ways of revising that might address the problem that resulted in the misunderstanding? It's a conversation, right? And a negative decision is usually a conversation ender, but it doesn't have to be. You can reinitiate the conversation in special circumstances when there's a real reason to do so, and if you do so with appropriate professionalness.
And can I just add one thing to that? I just wanted to say that often the response that you will get and the kind of the advice that you'll get also perhaps from your mentors and colleagues about this sort of situation is it's kind of a response of like, well, if you think you've been misunderstood, it's kind of your fault. And if you haven't, it's because you weren't as clear as you should have been. And quite often that will be true, and sometimes it's not true. But when you submit a paper to a journal, for example, and you address the comments, and you also will do this for some grant agencies, you'll resubmit your grant and you'll address the critique, the previous critique. You will say, I want to thank reviewer 2 for da 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 da. Unfortunately, I was not clear in the way that I described this, blah blah blah, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to clarify. So it's often best to take that sort of an attitude that if a reviewer is wrong, it is because you weren't as clear as you should have been. Even if that's not true, it will probably get you further than some sort of actual assertion that somebody doesn't understand the area and is not qualified to evaluate the work. It could, and that could be true as well. But but yeah, I do think that we'll get to appeals later. The process for appealing grants is a lot more sort of formal than I think for journals. But yeah, we'll talk about that.
Chris, do you want to take conferences?
Next slide, please. I'll try to make this pretty quick. So this is one place where actually, I think it generally is on you, the writer, if something isn't understood. Just for the obvious reason that conference abstracts are short, tend to be short. You know, there are certain kinds of conferences where you might write a 5 to 7 page paper or something like that. But in the case of the typical 1 to 2 page abstract, you're trying to get a fair amount of information across in a relatively short space. So the first most important job for the author is to ensure that they've got the right content there and that it's organized in a clear way. So I think there's 3 essential parts of the content. What's the original contribution of the work? What's the claim you're making, the result you found, etc. What's the kind of argument that substantiates that it's original and interesting? And then what's the relevance of this to broader questions and interests in the field or the relevant subfield? And you can use those 3 things to kind of structure your abstract. Typically, they're going to come in that order. Usually the middle part is the longest, the argument or the explanation or the justification, but the contribution should be really clear right at the beginning. The larger relevance of it should be really clear at the end or somewhere in there, and then the steps in the argumentation or the analysis or the interpretation of the results should be really, really, really clear. So it's your job. So the 3rd bullet point there, in the reference to reviewers' bandwidth, is just for you in putting this together to remember that typically reviewers are reviewing a bunch of abstracts. Some of them they're super experts on, some of them they're not. They're reading them over a pretty short period of time, and it would be great if they could all be super focused, but they're not, and they can't be. And that's why this is one place where it really is on you to make things as easy on them as you possibly can. Sometimes fewer words are better than more words. A use of space to give them a rest as they're reading through things. Crucial use of right brain friendly diagrams, designs, tables, etc. The last bullet point there about numbers is just to remember that for a lot of conferences there's way more submissions than there are spaces for people, and you might get an abstract rejected not because it's a bad abstract or a bad idea or anything like that, but just the numbers are not necessarily working in your favor. And so that's not a reason to feel like the work shouldn't go forward and you shouldn't try to submit it somewhere else. It's a reason, taking into account what the reviewers say, sometimes it's just a reason to keep going forward. And keep in mind there too that organizing committees play an important role in making selections. It's conferences aren't built by robots and computers. Sometimes an organizing committee has a certain kind of topic or issue they're interested in more than other ones, and so a very good abstract might not get accepted just because it kind of falls outside the domain of what the organizers for that conference want to focus on. And that's certainly their right to do that. They're putting in the work to make the conference happen, and they should be able to decide what the content is like. On the reviewing side, I think it's just the kind of pretty obvious things to keep in mind. It's a little easier to be kind of snippy, or let's say less civil in writing a review of an abstract because you're reading a lot of them. It relates to the bandwidth issue. If somebody hasn't done a good job of making clear what they're doing, you often get kind of annoyed with that because it feels like a bit of a waste of your time. So we often have to just kind of remind ourselves to say, give feedback in as constructive a way as possible, without being too with being as civil as we can. If you feel the need to say something just to get it out of your system, great use of the box in most online abstract review forums, which is only directed to the conference organizers. Get it out of your system there, and then write your comments to the author in a nicer way. Scale, so directive. So, again, here's the point. This is also in particular for a reviewer to be helpful to the organizing committee. Just be really clear, direct. It's okay to not beat around the bush. You can be direct about the fact that an abstract doesn't give any indication of what the broader significance of the work is. Saying exactly that to be clear to the organizers why you didn't give it a good score. And you can say that just in a straightforward way. That's not uncivil. Maybe this is not substantial enough for a 30-minute talk, if that's the kind of conference you're looking at. That's a thing that one should make it clear to the reviewers. To the organizers. Better suited as a poster than a talk. These are great, direct, clear comments to suggest. Scale, the reviews should not be longer than the abstract. That's a case where the debate is in private and not in public. If you've got that much to say about it, then probably it's a pretty interesting abstract, and you should get it out there in the conference so you can engage with the work in public. Last, if you don't really feel confident about your expertise, say it directly. That doesn't mean you shouldn't provide a review or your review won't be useful. So in many cases, conferences, are interested in bringing in work that doesn't just appeal to a narrow group, but has a more general impact and is interested in, like the LSA, is a clear example. And then it can be really helpful to know what a non-expert thinks about the ideas that are presented there. But you need to, signal that you are that person when that's the case. All right, that's enough for this. We've covered most of it, haven't we?
Then it's kind of, what now remains is kind of all the other issues, right? So we want to talk a little bit about the difference between double and single blind review. And I think this is a place, Fernanda, where you can maybe contribute more, because all the journals I've been involved in are double blind, where the reviewer doesn't know the author's identity and the author doesn't know the reviewer's identity. And the motivation for that is to maximize objectivity in the evaluation. The drawbacks, of course, is our field is so small that often it's not double blind. Often you will recognize the author based on the topic of the work. Also, because the reviewers are anonymous, it's easier to be non-civil because you're kind of protected by your anonymity. And there's been a move, therefore, to a non-blind review. And Fernanda, I think you've been involved in journals that don't do double-blind reviewing, right?
Yeah, so I'd say in cognitive psychology and cognitive science, blind review is not standard. And I would say that there are two competing movements at the moment: everything open and everybody's identified, and double blind. And it's so the as I understand this, I don't have a huge amount. Well, I've been part of a lot of discussions about this, but I wouldn't say I've really figured it out in my own head. The arguments for double blind review are really compelling. They, as you mentioned, there's an issue of bias that we're trying to deal with, and it's been shown empirically that women and people from underrepresented groups in particular tend to do better when there is double blind review. So that is really important. And one of the major journals in cognitive psychology has recently proposed going to double blind reviewing because of that. On the other side, there is an idea that reviewers, for example, should identify themselves, that we shouldn't be hiding behind this anonymity. I think, Chris, you already mentioned that it often makes you a little bit more civil when you know that you will be identified, that people will know who you are, that you wrote the review. And also there's a movement in many disciplines towards preprints. So the idea is that when you've got a manuscript written, before you send it to a journal, you might upload it to a preprint server where anybody can get access to it. And it's part of the open science movement. We've got the bullet immediately above on that point. And if you would upload your paper to a preprint server, unless you have not identified yourself, you now make double-blind review essentially impossible, because even if you go to a journal that does double-blind review, if you've also previously uploaded your paper to a preprint site, you're going to be identifiable. So I think this is something that is not clear at the moment.
And yes, I agree, it's not clear. It's something that we are struggling with as a field, figuring out how to do this in a way that is fair and doesn't disadvantage certain people. I mean, we don't yet have clear answers.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've basically touched on everything, Chris and Fernanda. Was there something that we had skipped, or is it time to hand over to the participants for questions?
I think so.
I'll just say one more quick thing about the open science. I just wanted to add that in the review process for journals in particular, as part of this open science movement, there are more and more journals that are requiring authors to submit all of their materials, often to something like the Open Science Framework website. And materials would be any scripts that you've used to analyze your data, the raw data themselves, the and the idea is that some reviewers will want to verify your work and might redo some of your analyses. In general, that expectation that you're going to make your data and your code open is a sort of an indication on your part as an author that you are happy to be scrutinized. And that's also becoming a trend in journal reviewing, I think.
And part of that whole open science movement and the double blind, or completely not blind review, there's also some journals that have started publishing the reviews, right? So often in an online supplement where your review is really public, and that really make people put more time into it and be more civil, because it will also be published. So there is this move to move everything out of the dark, hidden back world of the anonymous review to a more open situation. And there's a lot of good in that. But as Fernanda said, there's also clear evidence of that introducing biases. So it's a tough knot to untie. David, we have like 30 minutes remaining. Question time?
Sure. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we'll go back to the basic screen. So this is the part of the webinar now where the panelists will take your questions. So if you haven't already done so, you can ask your questions now using the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please say which one. So I know we've got one already. Give me just a moment here, and I will pull it up. Okay, here's a good question. Could you address the appeal issue / process in journal publication decisions?
Yeah, so that's the one topic that I had forgotten to cover, and then we keep on forgetting it. It is not common, right? Typically, if you get a decision of your paper having been declined, usually you will just have to accept that, because usually that is the right decision, either because the paper just wasn't a good fit for the journal, or because the paper just wasn't ready, right? There's a serious flaw in the argumentation that maybe you didn't realize before submission, or maybe it's clear that additional work, additional data collection is needed, such that the project might be in principle publishable, but the version that would be publishable would be so different from the version you submitted that it would be a different paper on the same topic. So in those cases, then you get value from the feedback you received. It gives you an idea of how to take the project further, but that project in its current form is not going to succeed at that journal. There are cases where you get a negative decision and where it might be appropriate to appeal that, to go back into conversation with the editorial team and say, you've decided to decline my paper, can we have a conversation about it? I mean, can I revise the paper in such a way that it would succeed at your journal? I really think it should only happen in exceptional circumstances, instances where, as Chris and Fernanda have talked about, where, you know, there was maybe a clear misunderstanding of a core part of your argument, whether that be on the side of reviewers or side of the editorial team. That happens. We do complicated work, and sometimes arguments just don't come across clearly. Sometimes it's because you weren't clear enough, but if a negative judgment came from misunderstanding, you know, you can enter into a conversation and explain that and see whether the editorial team will be open to reconsider the decision. Sometimes a decision also would indicate that certain work would have to be done for this paper to succeed, and there's a judgment that that work is so significant as to be virtually impossible, or something that would take an extraordinarily long time, and therefore probably this paper isn't going to succeed. Editorial teams can also make misjudgments there, right? So if you know that, well, actually I have access to the, you know, participants I need to run this additional study, and I can do it fairly quickly, maybe I've already done it, you know, it is okay to re-engage with the editorial team about things like that. I think the really important thing is to do that with a great care and sophistication and graciousness. You are dealing with people who have put a lot of time and effort into your paper and into 50 or 100 other papers they're working with. And if you want them to reconsider a decision, you want them to feel valued, not disrespected. So it requires care, but I think it's possible, and I think it's definitely appropriate in the spirit of this being a conversation, and you're continuing the conversation. In my career of publishing in journals of 25 years, I have once done that. And in the end, the paper was accepted. So I've done it myself, and therefore I can't tell people not to do it to me as editor. Chris and Fernanda, do you want to add to that?
I did it once, and it wasn't, and the whole process was not very pleasant. And I think in the end, I think the lesson I took away from that is that, I mean, actually, I still think that the assessment was wrong. But I think that the lesson to take away from it is that that was not the right journal for that work. And there are other things going on, and it just, at some point, it's really not worth it. It's better to move on and figure out what the next step is. So sometimes it is worth it. It's totally appropriate. And sometimes it's not. And it's hard to know that in the moment. I didn't figure that out until later.
Yeah, I think everything that's been said, and plus I'll say that this is becoming a topic of some interest in the scientific community, in the sort of improving our practices in scholarship and science, and because there's a concern that appealing decisions is part of the sort of hidden whisper network, that some people have the kind of personality and the kind of maybe clout in the field that makes them feel that they're likely to be successful if they appeal a decision. Other people, it's just not their personality, and this is unfair. This is not the way we want things to work. So I'm increasingly hearing conversations about journals trying to come up with explicit procedures for appealing decisions, so that everybody has access to that mechanism and understands what the basis of a negative or positive decision would be. And I would kind of go with what Chris has said, that most of the time it doesn't really pay off. It probably is best to cut your losses and go on to another journal. But I have appealed and successfully, and then often it's because, you know, as a mentor, you feel like your student's work is being misunderstood and not treated properly, and you feel like you want to deal with that. That can't stand, and so you want to step in, but of course not every mentor is going to do that, and that's not a good way for things to work. So yeah.
Great, thank you all for those responses. We have a couple of questions that are pretty similar, so I'll read them together. I'm interested in the civility question. I've received reviews that were very collegial and helpful, and also those that were unkind. When I have written reviews, I have tried to always think about the author in terms of how I would feel about the feedback. Do the editors feel some responsibility to intervene for uncivil reviews? And then the other question is, when is it appropriate for editors not to share reviewer comments with the author beyond those that are private to the editor?
I feel very strongly about this. At Language, I would be wrong to say often, but it would be wrong to say not, you know, infrequently either. So ask reviewers to reword, to rephrase. You know, do you want to reconsider the tone? Every single time I've done that, reviewers were happy to do that. If a reviewer is really uncivil and unprofessional, I think as editors we have the right and the responsibility to just disregard such reviews and not use them. I have come close to that, but I've not actually ever not used the review. I've always been successful at getting reviewers to revise their reviews. Sometimes even when that happens, you know, you might feel as the editor or associate editor that a review doesn't quite hit the appropriate level of civility and professionalness. And I think then it's also the responsibility of the editor to acknowledge that, either in the cover note that goes to the author, or sometimes privately in an email. It's unfortunate when that happens, but I think that's our responsibility as editors. And then we have to acknowledge people have different styles, right? So what some people's style is just very direct. So, you know, it's a difficult balance to get. Chris, Fernanda, I don't know, do you have experiences, ideas?
I have rewritten a review before. I mean, it was a funny case. It was not for a journal. It was for, I'm also editor for a book series for Oxford Press. It was in the context of that. It was inappropriate, but there was content in the review that was appropriate and important. And it wasn't not rewriting, it was editing. And I told both the reviewer and the author that I'd done that. And I shared a copy of my edited review with the reviewer, who acknowledged, I mean, wasn't happy, but acknowledged that was a thing that one was appropriate to do.
Yeah, I've done the same. Change a review, but send it back to the reviewer and say, I have changed these sections as follows. Are you okay with this? You know, with these changes, I can include it in the decision to the author.
Interesting. So I have had, so I'll just say that when I'm a reviewer, I sometimes will go through, even if I'm writing a review that's anonymous, there are some journals that require that you review anonymously. I'll sometimes as my final edit go through it as if I'm identified, as if I'm typing my name at the bottom of it. And I find every time that I will just end up taking out words and little phrasings that suggest a little bit of irritation or a kind of grumpiness or snippiness. I don't think I intended it when I wrote it, but it's just it just creeps in. And that I think is a useful tip, is to just go through your review one last time as if you were face to face with the person, and would you be happy to be communicating in exactly that way. As far as editing people's reviews, when I've been editor, like I feel like, yeah, I think the process both of you described sounds reasonable, and I hadn't really thought of doing that. I just sort of feel like an editor can't go in and change a reviewer's review, that the review should be sort of, you know, exactly what the reviewer's thoughts were, but the kind of thing you've described seems quite reasonable to me.
Great.
You know, to make some edits and go back.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you all. And here's another question now. Question on blindness of peer review. Is there any evidence that single blind review or open review inhibits criticism, especially of very senior authors? And they specify a justifiable criticism of the work, not incivility.
I don't know if there's evidence, but it would be hard to believe that it wasn't true. I mean, I've had experience with, in the double-blind case, with senior authors who have critical assessments of their work, and they get mad. Sometimes, not always. This is not uniform. It's just, it's happened. I mean, everybody gets mad, but the anger feels a little bit more intense when it's coming from a very senior and prominent person, and so it makes it harder. Certainly on the editorial side. So I would think it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't be a issue.
Everybody gets upset about negative reviews, right? How can't you? As researchers, our identities are tied to our ideas. So if your ideas are being criticized and negatively reviewed, it feels to you as if your identity is being criticized and negatively reviewed. So we all respond negatively to them. But Fernanda, when you were talking about grants, you mentioned that the track record of the PI is something that granting agencies look at. So that's kind of a case where maybe specifically senior people get a benefit because they are known.
Well, yeah. So with grants, you can't. With grants, I think. Well, I'm not seeing any movement towards double-blind review, because a criterion for evaluating a grant is typically the PI, the credentials of the PI, and what you say is true, that it maybe, I think people believe that the system, in fact, overall is biased towards more senior established people. I think that there's data showing that in terms of grant funding, the rich get richer. So people with funding tend to get more funding. You know, some of it is because if you have that track record, then it feels like you're less of a gamble, you know, to give you $500,000 to do some project. And I think all funding agencies have programs in place for new investigators and junior investigators, where they're in a separate, they sort of a separate pot of money, so they're not directly competing against the more senior investigators. And when those junior investigators' proposals are evaluated, the reviewers are told not to take into account the track record in terms of publications and previous grant history, maybe to take into account things like whether the person seems to have received training in the relevant area. But yeah.
Okay, here's an interesting question. Does double blind mean double blind for life? That is it a violation of best practices to tell the author that you were a reviewer for their paper?
You mean after the process has completed?
Presumably,
yeah. I don't know. It feels to me at that point it's out of the hand of the journal, right? So if once a paper has appeared and you tell the author that, oh, I was one of your reviewers, you know, the journal can't anymore be involved at that stage. If you do it during the review process, I mean, I think you could be subject to sanction from the journal. But I don't know. I don't know if it is. Where does one come down on the ethics of that? mean, I think I would be uncomfortable revealing my identity even after it's appeared. Fernanda?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question and very tricky. In all kinds of domains we review anonymously, right? Like if you provide a tenure or a promotion letter for somebody, you know, the person being evaluated doesn't normally know the identities. They might know some of the people who wrote letters, but not all of them. And I feel like whether it's a grant or a journal article or a letter, then going up to the person and saying, hey, I reviewed your paper. And I suspect people only say that if they gave a positive review. I feel like it's sort of weird because there's sort of, I feel like you're putting the other person in a position of being indebted to you.
Yeah.
It's very subtly and implicitly, but it might create that sort of an expectation that you'll reciprocate at some point if you review the other person's work. So I don't know. I feel like it's best to let that stuff. Yeah, it makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
There are also these cases though where dialogues come out of this process. You know, someone's reviewing something, an article, whatever, and it gets published, and then it was in virtue of that initial interaction with the work in the reviewing process that the original reviewer gets active in the question, and then whatever that turns into a back and forth between the two parties or however many parties it is. And I mean, the normal kind of course of science publication. And so in that kind of context, one might think that it's part of the openness of the exchange to acknowledge that was, which, I mean, I don't know how one does it, but directly with the person or whatever, that you're, that's the way that your engagement with the work began. I mean, you don't have to. It could just be, oh, I read this paper and I got in Journal X, and that got me going on it. But there's a kind of openness to doing it that way that is also, not obviously problematic.
Yeah. So as you see, we don't have clear answers here because I think it's an iffy area, but I think we've all expressed discomfort with the idea. So maybe only in exceptional circumstances should you reveal your identity as a reviewer, even after the fact.
Well, I'll just read something that's come in from one of the attendees that says, long after I had gone all the way through the tenure and promotion process, I was very touched when a senior colleague whose opinion I revered let me know that he had been an external reviewer for me. It seemed important to him to reveal that to me, and it meant the world to me. So,
yeah.
It's just
yeah, I think it can be like that. Absolutely.
Yeah. But, okay, another question here. Sorry. Yes.
I mean,
yes, go ahead.
There is this other thing. Maybe this is worth. I mean, I'd like to hear if anybody has any opinions on this. There's this other thing that sometimes happens where reviewers will out themselves in the review process. Hopefully in consultation with the editor or associate editor they're working with, but where a reviewer, I mean, just for whatever reason, it becomes clear that it couldn't be anybody but that reviewer because they're the one who have that response. And in my experience, the only time, I mean, any time that I've offered to do that, it's been an offer outside of the review to the editor, who sometimes says no. But sometimes says yes, and it's like, yes, you're right, it's clear. I don't know if that's a little different or not. But at least that is part of it's done through the interaction with the journal.
At Language, we have a double-blind review process. Some reviewers, as a matter of principle, sign their reviews, and some, as a matter of the nature of the review, reveal who they are, as Chris said. So our approach as Language has been, if somebody signs their review, I will write back and say, did you intend to do so? We do double-blind review, but if you want to reveal yourself, you can, right? So we won't enforce the reviewer, because some people do that as a statement of principle. So yeah, it's somehow different if it happens in that context and in consultation with the editorial team, so that everybody knows what's happening. And as editor, you then have to also treat that review differently than an anonymous one, right? Because we write reviews differently, whether they're anonymous or not. So it changes how you think about the review.
Yeah, one place where I feel like it's very tricky to be anonymous, and I haven't had to do it, so which I'm glad about as a reviewer, is if somebody submits a paper and it's directly on my work, it's following up something that I've done, and the reviewer and the editor asks me to review the paper because, you know, it's somebody's following up on my work. I feel like that's a very decent thing of the editor to do. But then I also feel that the first sentence of my review has to say, okay, this is Fernanda here, and so keep that in mind.
Yeah.
This paper is on my work, so I want you to contextualize my comments in that, with that information. And I think that otherwise it's kind of weird to write a review where you're pretending not to be the person whose work is being targeted.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great. Here we have another question, and this may be the last or the next to the last one. We're coming up on 2:30. What can authors and editors do when the reviews come back showing very different opinions? For example, one says very good, should be accepted, while the other says terrible, reject once and for all.
It happens all the time. It's not unusual.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's not surprising that it's not unusual. We deal with complicated issues, which are often subject to viewpoints, to departure points. So it actually is not very unusual. And I think that's really a place where the associate editor or editor, it comes down on them to not necessarily adjudicate between the reviews, but to give the author clear guidelines for how to approach a revision. If reviewers make opposite recommendations or even ask for opposite revisions, that are incompatible with each other, the author can't possibly do that. I think that's a place where really the editor and associate editor needs to step in and give the author ideas, suggestions.
Yeah, I would add that this kind of experience, which everybody will have probably more than once, is a great way to decide for yourself as an author which journals you should be submitting your work to. That is, some editorial teams are better at dealing with this situation than others. Sometimes the right decision is to listen to the positive review. Sometimes the right one is the negative one. Sometimes they find some way to synthesize the parts. What's bad is when they don't, like kind of what Unsuggest was just saying, if you're not getting guidance to help you resolve that situation, that means that you might not want to submit to that journal anymore.
If you don't get guidance, that would be a place where I think it would be reasonable to write back to the editor and say, thank you for the reviews, I've read through them. Here is how I am imagining the revision. Does this sound reasonable? The editor in all likelihood won't say, sure, do it like that and I'll accept your paper. It will still be like, well, we need to see the final paper, but yes, that sounds like a reasonable path or a non-reasonable path. It's a conversation, right? And you can have little sub-conversations along the way to the revision.
Great. Well, it is, we're coming up on 2:30 here, so it's time to close. So I want to thank our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us and for putting up with the tactical infelicities that we had at the last minute. So many thanks to all of you in the audience for taking time out of your day to be with us. We will have a recording of this webinar available possibly this afternoon, but certainly no later than Monday, and we will let you know that it's ready. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye
Thank
now.
you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.